Welcome ladies and gentlemen, this is Mon, and in this guide, I'm gonna go over the best build for critical pulse. This was a recently heavily requested guide, so let's start by going over its weapon features. But before I do that, let me know in the comments which guide you'd like to see next. Starting with the first feature, triggers continuous power surge on hit, with a 70% chance to generate a deviant particle near the player, which are small yellow orbs, and you'll have to pick them up to enter charged state. Now really quickly, power surge is essentially 50% psi intensity of damage. Here for the critical pulse, it's continuous power surge, so it's going to be multiple instances of damage, and you'll also inflict power surge status, which is minus 40 accuracy. The damage is of shock element type, it cannot crit, cannot strike weak spots, and will not decay with distance. Now coming back to the weapon features, continuous power surge triggers damage every 0.5 seconds within 3 seconds on the target that you shot, and higher stacks of continuous power surge shorten that interval between each damage proc, which can stack up to 5 times for a minimum interval of 0.26 seconds. So this is here just to help your single target damage. Then while you're in charge state, hitting a target consumes one charged orb to create an orb of lightning that deals shock elemental status damage of 75% psi intensity to all targets within 5 meters every 0.5 seconds. This damage benefits from power surge damage bonuses and has a 5% chance to generate deviant particles as well. And this feature is also what's going to allow critical pulse to deal its nice AoE damage. Then lastly, shock elemental damage plus 30%. So now that we've gone over the weapon features, you should know that this weapon is pretty much a pure elemental weapon, so gear stars will impact the weapon's damage, but the weapon's own blueprint will not. Moving on to the calibration, you will want to use portable style. The reason for this is simply because there's not really a good option as calibration. This is just the best out of your options. The other option would be precision style, which reduces your reload speed, which is exactly not what we want. Now as for the calibration substats, you will want to use double elemental since this weapon is an elemental weapon. Moving on to the critical pulse accessories, starting with the optic, the choice literally doesn't matter, it's just for your own preference since it doesn't affect your damage. However, the ammo will affect your damage. So if you're clearing silos, you're either going to want to use ideally suppression AP arrows or penetration AP arrows, depending on the type of enemy that you're fighting. So if it's a humanoid enemy, so Vulture or Rosetta, you will want to use penetration. But if it's a deviant, then you're going to want to use suppression AP arrows. Now if you're just clearing overworld mobs, so in the map, or if you're clearing monoliths, then the ideal arrow to run is going to be blasting AP arrows. However, if you can't afford any of these, of course the norm usually is going to be tungsten AP arrow. Moving on to your secondary and melee weapons, starting with the secondary, you essentially have two options. You have the bingo as bullseye option, which here you're really going to use it to mark enemies, since after switching weapons, the first hit will trigger the bullseye guaranteed. So it's really nice with bingo, and really what it does is 8% vulnerability for 12 seconds. So you can either use bingo against elites or great ones if you really want to boss with critical pulse. But another thing that you can do is instead of running bingo, you run outer space for the single target situations. Since outer space is essentially power surge, but for single target, and they both use the same key gear. Then for your melee weapon, the weapon that you're going to want to use is going to be the kukri. The reason for this is because when you defeat a target, it'll grant all of your other weapons attack multiplier plus 30%. Here, I know it says attack plus 30%, but it's actually attack multiplier. And not just that, when defeating an enemy with a heavy strike, you'll gain 20% psi intensity, which is really great as well, since your elemental damage, so your power surge damage, scales off of that. And now to trigger this easily, you're going to want to farm an ice pod deviation, which is this deviation right here. It'll craft sticky ice crystals for you. And what you do with these sticky ice crystals is you just throw them on the ground, you hold your melee button like this, and you'll just get the buffs. So here I get the attack multiplier plus 30%, and not just that, you'll also get your psi intensity increase. So if I just show it again, currently without hovering anything, I'm sitting at 1047 psi intensity. If I throw an ice cube, I destroy it, you see that here I'm sitting at 1230 psi intensity. So this is why the kukri is going to be the preferred melee weapon. For the deviation, unfortunately we still don't have a dedicated deviation for power surge weapons, so you'll have to use Mini Feaster, and the reason why is because the Mini Feaster will give status damage bonus, and it will max out at 80% total. And now there is a trick to use this deviation effectively. So if we read the description, it says continuously follows the player and summons one tentacle near an enemy every 1.5 seconds. This means that let's say you're doing a silo, you'll want to summon the Mini Feaster before you even get to the boss room so that it starts stacking up tentacles, so that once you're in the boss room, you instantly start at 80% status damage bonus instead of 20%. Moving on to your key gear, you have two options. You have the Mayfly goggles and you also have the overloaded pants. Now, starting with the overload pants, it essentially makes it so that after you trigger power surge 20 times, the next 6 arrows that you shoot will consume reserve ammo instead, and you get shock damage plus 20%. And so essentially what this key gear allows you to do is after you've shot a few times, you will essentially be able to continuously shoot arrows without ever needing to reload. As for the first option, you have the Mayfly goggles, which increases your power surge trigger count by 1, which means that every time you trigger power surge, you'll get an extra power surge trigger. However, this is going to come at the cost of reducing your power surge damage by 30%. So overall, it's a 40% damage increase since you trigger it 2 times, but each trigger deals 30% less damage. Now, as for which one you should pick, if we're just comparing both of the key gears with the same mods, with their preferred mods, which here where I was using the same, well then they pretty much perform the same, and there's not much difference. What I will say though is if you wish to use outer space as secondary, then you have to use the Mayfly goggles. So just from here on out in the video, I'm just going to assume that you have the Mayfly goggles and not the overloaded pants, just to make the guide a little easier to understand, since if you use overloaded pants, there are some extra stuff you have to consider for when you pick your pants mod. So I'm just going to assume that you will be using Mayfly goggles. If you wish to see more Once Human guides or content, then do consider liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and turning on the bell for future video guides notifications. Now for your gear sets, starting with the strongest option, it's going to be 3 Treacherous Tides pieces with 2 Gravity Tides pieces, or instead of Gravity Tides pieces, you could opt for 2 Stormweaver pieces. Now starting with the Treacherous Tides pieces, those 3 pieces will allow you to gain up to 50% status damage bonus as long as your HP is below 70% and you have low sanity. Now here ideally you set as 0% sanity to allow for other stuffs to give you even more buffs, which I'll get into later, but essentially this is what 0% sanity looks like when you have 3-piece Treacherous, and it'll correspond to a max HP reduction of 60%. Now how do you do this? You can achieve this by eating a plethora of food items. So you could eat spoiled food, you could eat sanity corrosion capsules, but ideally if you're a chef, you craft yourself minus 1000 sanity large boiled water. Now to do this, you're simply going to go to your stove, you go in creative cooking. Of course, by the way, you can only do this if you're a chef. You're going to want to put in 5 polluted water and 5 dirty water, and you're going to want to creative cook. And what it will give you is essentially the boiled water here that reduces your sanity by 1000 points. So this is going to be really great. You just drink a single one and it will reduce all of your sanity. Now coming back to the gear set, the 2 Gravity Tide pieces here, the reason for this, why we're running them, or the 2 Stormweaver, is because the 2-piece effects both give magazine capacity plus 15%. And this is where I'm going to go over how you're actually going to try to get 2 arrows on your critical pulse. Now, for those of you that watched my previous critical pulse guide, you will remember me saying that you shouldn't run 2 arrows critical pulse build, but the reason for this was because I was using, let me just find it. I was using this mod right here, Mag Expansion, which critically sacrifices a lot of important stats to get that second arrow, which makes it actually worse than if you were just running a single arrow build. So now, instead of doing that, you're actually going to want to, instead of using like 2-piece shelter, you will want to use 2 Gravity Tides pieces to get that 2 arrow build. Simple reason for this is because you're sacrificing 8% elemental damage for 15% magazine capacity instead of previously what we're doing, where we'd sacrifice reload speed, elemental damage for essentially the extra arrow. So now you're sacrificing much less, and so essentially this is why we're actually going to want to go with Gravity Tides 2-piece. Now, you're not just going to only want the 2 gravity tight pieces, because that's not going to be enough for you to have the 2 arrow build. And spoiler alert for the Suffix and Substats priority, but for your gloves, your boots, and your pants mod, you will want to look for 12% magazine capacity on 2 mods and 7.2% on the last one. So 2 gold and 1 blue substat, and even 1 gold, 2 purple substats will work as well. And so this is how you get the 2 arrow build if you're on the low HP preset. But here's a comparison between the 2 arrows build with 2 gravity tight pieces and the 1 arrow build with 2 shelter pieces. Now, if you're in a Way of Winter scenario, or if you don't want to play with a low HP preset, then this is your other option, and that's going to be Blackstone 4-piece with a 1-piece Lone Wolf. Now here, the 4-piece Blackstone can give you up to 35% elemental damage bonus if you don't craft it with Hot Rock ore or Cold Crystal ore. And now obviously, if you're in a Way of Winter scenario, you will want to craft them with either Hot Rock ore or Cold Crystal ore, depending on where you are on the map. And the reason for this is that if you craft it with those ores, you can get up to 60% elemental damage bonus. And so this is why we're going to use the 4-piece Blackstone. Then as for the 1-piece Lone Wolf, this is there to give you 10% magazine capacity. Now here, it's not going to be 15, so now obviously you're going to have to fill that little gap with another talent mod with more than just 3 mods with magazine capacity. Because if you were using the treacherous build route, where spoiler alert, you can only have 3 talent mods, well, you're going to need 12% magazine capacity on all 3 mods. But here, since you're using Blackstone, you're not low HP, I'm going to assume that you're not using Lunar Suffix mods, and so you will be able to get magazine capacity on your top mod or on your helmet mod. Moving on to the mask hide that you're going to want to use, the ideal mask hide to use is going to be Lucky Rabbit Fur. The reason for this is for the 10% elemental damage bonus that it gives, which will help you balance out your elemental to status damage, since usually you should have more status damage bonus than elemental damage bonus. Now here, I do know it says after scoring a crit, but make no mistakes, you do not need to score crit hits. And I can simply show it to you guys here by taking a look at my stat sheet. You'll see that I'm sitting at 18 and 48% elemental damage bonus, 18 for everything else except shock, and 48 for shock. And here I obviously have the gravity tides with a Lucky Rabbit Fur with no Cradle perks. So if I just shoot this dummy without landing a crit hit, I take a look at my stat sheet, and you'll see that here I'm sitting at 28 and 58, which means that the 10% from Lucky Rabbit Fur has applied even without scoring crit hits. So it's literally like deal any type of damage, you'll gain the 10% elemental damage bonus. Moving on to your Cradle perks, I'm currently in an Endless Stream scenario, so I'll go over those Cradle perks. If you're in a Novice scenario, you'll unfortunately have different options. But starting with those, you'll want to have Anti-Phase for the crossbow damage bonus and for the damage bonus against phase anomalies. Then you'll want Status Enhancement for the status damage bonus, Elemental Sense, and Transient Impact for the keyword, so Power Surge damage bonuses. Then here you're left with 4 options, and here usually I would use something like Tactical Combo with Deviant Energy Defense, Area Suppression, and Tactical Leap. However, the crossbow doesn't deal much damage from like its crossbows, or not crossbows, from its arrows. So usually I'm just not going to pick this unless if you go against like Treant, which has an extra damage multiplier for its weak spots, where you could actually choose this. But for the crossbow, I will just pick Deviant Energy Defense, Area Suppression, Tactical Leap, and Rapid Aid. Now, Deviant Energy Defense is going to allow you to have a shield so that you don't just explode if something tickles you, since especially if you're using the low HP build. The Area Suppression and Tactical Leap will both give you damage bonus or damage reduction. So Area Suppression is damage reduction, Tactical Leap is damage bonus against any type of enemy in the game as long as you're inside a silo. So here I do know that for Tactical Leap it says 20% damage against deviants, but make no mistakes, it's actually against any type of enemy in the game. And for Area Suppression, it also says that it's only effective against monsters, but I'll show you real quick that it's actually against any type of enemy in the game. Not just that, but for Area Suppression, all what you need to do is to perma-jump and you'll get the effect. However, for Tactical Leap, you actually have to stay in the air for 1 second to convert into a 3 seconds of buff duration. But let me just show it to you. Currently, I have no stats, essentially, so no damage reduction. I have like 10% weapon and status damage reduction, but you'll notice that this doesn't affect anything. And for my damage bonuses, I have almost nothing. So if I just trigger both things at the same time and take a look at my stat sheet, you'll see that I have 20% damage bonus against any type of enemy in the game, 10% damage bonus against all of their shields. As for my damage reduction, I have 30% damage reduction against any type of enemy in the game as well. So this proves that area suppression and tactical leap both work against any type of enemy. Moving on to your food buffs, starting with the food slot. If you're going to be bossing, or let's say if you're going to clear silos, what you're going to want to run is going to be mixed fried hot dog for the 20% damage bonus against marked targets, which is very important against bosses, since this counts as the same damage multiplier as damage against X type of enemy, which is really strong since you don't have a lot of it. Now, if you are a chef, the second buff that you're going to want to run, or by the way, these could also be used interchangeably depending on if you actually want to deal more damage on the bosses or against the normal enemies as you clear through, but it's going to be Layered Galaxy, which is going to grant you a 30% elemental damage bonus while you're airborne, which by the way will always be active as long as you permajump. If you allow me to demonstrate it to you, currently I am sitting at 111% elemental damage bonus if I'm not in the air, but let's say I just jump, whatever, I get 152%, which with the buffs that like my chef does and whatever, it just increased my thing by like 41%. So these are the two buffs that you're going to want to usually run. Now, if you want to do pure boss content, which is kind of weird to do with Critical Pulse since it doesn't excel at that, then you're going to want to eat mixed fried hot dog once again as priority, but then bone and deviated sausage for the 15% damage bonus against bosses, which counts as the same damage multiplier that mixed fried hot dog gives. But again, this is kind of rare, like it's kind of weird to use Critical Pulse against bosses, but these are the two food buffs that you want to run. Now, if you want to do bossing against a Light Dreamer, those enemies are counted as elite enemies, so instead of using bone and deviated sausage as your second food buff, you will actually want to use roulette dumplings and try to roll for the damage plus 15% against elite enemies. Now that we've got the silo food buff, bossing food buff, and the Light Dreamer food buff out of the way, moving on to the drink food buff, the two drink buffs that you're going to want to eat are going to be Whimsical Drink. Whimsical is going to give you status damage bonus, which is important for your power surge damage, and your second food buff is going to be Sparkling Pumpkin Soup. And the reason for this is because it'll increase your power surge damage. Now, if you're worried about not being able to proc a Tactical Leaps effect, since now we're not actually going to drink Stardust Energy Drink, one thing that you should do, that you can do and should do, is you go to your mimetics and you either buy jump boosters from someone else, or you unlock the jump booster mimetics that is unlocked between the level 5 to 15. And so what jump boosters are is they'll give you the ability to do double jump for 30 seconds, and each jump booster can be used up to 5 times. So essentially, you're just going to go to your advanced supply bench or whatever. They are really cheap to craft. It's 5 electronics and like 5 adhesives, 5 rubber. And just by crafting those, you will be able to double jump. Moving on to your mod Suffix and Substats priority, starting with the weapon mod and the mask mod, you will want to go with Power Surge Suffix, and the reason for this is because of its very strong substats. Starting with the Fix attribute, which is Power Surge damage, this is very important since you usually don't have a lot of that. Now, as linked attribute, you will want to prioritize for damage plus 8% on targets with Power Surge, and the reason for this is because this line multiplier counts as damage against X type multiplier, which is incredibly strong since you don't have a lot of it as well. Now here's where you would usually, if like you're not exceptionally lucky, you're just going to get one line of damage bonus against X type of enemy, depending on the type of enemy that you want to fight against. However, if you're really lucky, you could also get shock damage at the same time, or you get 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemy. Of course, here, if you want to be able to deal more damage, you would ideally make presets for different type of enemies in the game. So one for normal enemies, great ones, and whatever. Then coming back to the other suffixes, for the helmet suffix and the top suffix, the ideal suffix to run is going to be lunar, but if you don't have lunar suffixes, just run talent suffix mods. I'm going to dive into the talent suffix substats later, but starting with the lunar ones, you will obviously want to go for elemental damage with status damage with 1 damage bonus against X type. depending on the type of enemy that you want to fight against, of course. And really, the reason for this is because the lunar suffix mods scaled higher, as a matter of fact, double the value of what talent suffix can give. Then for everything else, so for your pants, boots, and gloves, you will ideally want, well, not ideally, you have to go with talent suffix. And so with fixed attribute elemental damage, linked attribute, this is where you will actually want to prioritize the magazine capacity line and get it to 12%, because this is going to be very important to get that 2 arrow build, especially if you're running lunar suffix mods and keyword suffix mods, since if you don't reach the 31.2% magazine capacity threshold, you will not be able to get 2 arrows in your builds. But of course, if you don't have lunar suffix mods, or if you just don't run them, then you have less pressure. You can have like multiple mods with magazine capacity and they don't need to be maxed out. But essentially, ideally, you get gold magazine capacity, then you get either 2 damage bonus against X-type, or you get 1 damage bonus against X-type with either status damage bonus or reload speed bonus. Remember, if you're a bit confused, feel free to check out the spreadsheet that I have for this build. It's going to be in the description of this video. Moving on to your mods, starting with the critical pulse mod, the mod that you're going to want to run is going to be Static Shock. The reason for this is simply because of its incredible 20% power surge damage bonus. Albeit it does reduce your power surge status duration by 50%, it doesn't really matter that much since the power surge status isn't what's important, since it's the thing that reduces the accuracy of your enemies, so it's only for like PvP. So Static Shock is the one that you're going to want to run. You don't want to run Surge Amplifier, since Surge Amplifier is essentially Static Shock, but you have to stack it up. And not just that, it only stacks up to 15% last time I tested it. So unfortunately, this is literally a worse version of Static Shock. Then you wouldn't want to run Shock Diffusion because, well, if you just read the effect, it says when applying Power Surge or when triggering Power Surge, you'll apply the Power Surge status to one enemy within 10 meters of the target. This is literally useless. It's not going to increase your damage and it's not going to affect it. Then we also have Shock Rampage, which you don't want to run because what Shock Rampage does is it increases your Power Surge trigger chance each time you inflict Power Surge. But the crossbow has literally 100% Power Surge trigger chance since it triggers continuous Power Surge on hit. The 70% chance here is not for Power Surge, but rather for the Deviant Particle generation. Then moving on to your secondary weapons mod, if it is the outer space that you want to run, then again you want to run this mod right here, Static Shock. But if you're running Bingo, you're going to want to run Vulnerability Amplifier to add an extra 8% vulnerability. Then for your melee mod, it literally doesn't matter since you're not using Kukri to hit enemies, but I just have Melee Amplifier just for the funsies. Now moving on to the helmet mod, the ideal mod to run is going to be Work of Proficiency. This is going to give you 10% reload speed and 20% elemental damage as long as you reload with an empty magazine, which is really easy to do with a crossbow since you just shoot 2 times and your magazine is empty. Not just that, but the elemental damage is also going to help you balance out your elemental to status damage ratio. Now, of course, if you don't have a lunar one or just a good Work of Proficiency, you can always run Deviation Expert for the 20% status damage, but just know that you're not going to gain much from the 10% fire rate. Now, don't need to worry about the range since that only affects your arrows damage, which isn't that important. Then, moving on to your mask mod, the mod that you're going to want to use is going to be Thunderclap, and the reason for this is because after triggering Power Surge 19 times, the 20th Power Surge is going to be called Celestial Thunder, which is a shock damage of 200% psi intensity. So this is the mask mod that you're going to want to run. The other mask mod for Power Surge weapons would be First Electrocution, which only works against enemies that do not have the Power Surge status, which, well, the crossbow applies the Power Surge status, since if we take a look at the Power Surge keyword details, inflict Power Surge status. So yeah, you're going to want to use Thunderclap for your mask mod. Then for your gloves mod, you have 2 options. You have Elemental Overload and you have Status Enhancement. The pick is literally just going to depend on whether you have more status damage or elemental damage. So after using all of your buffs and whatever, if you have more status damage than elemental damage, then you're going to want to use Elemental Overload. But if you have more elemental damage than status damage, then you're going to want to try to run a status enhancement. Of course, here keep in mind that getting that 12% magazine capacity on the mod that you run is still very important, especially if you're not running a lunar mod. So unfortunately, sometimes, just so you know, magazine capacity is more important here than balancing out your status to elemental damage ratio. Then for your shoe mod, the ideal shoe mod to run if you're on the low HP preset is going to be Rush Hour, since Rush Hour's effect is every 10% HP loss grants 4% status damage bonus, which is permanent, and if you're on the low HP preset, that is a permanent 24% status damage bonus. However, if you're running Blackstone, so if you're not on the low HP preset, then you're going to want to use Covered Advance, and the reason for this is because between all of the other remaining options, it's either less conditional or straight up gives better buffs, since the effect is taking no damage for only 4 seconds, will grant you 20% status damage for 30 seconds. Then moving on to your top mod, the ideal top mod to run if you're on low HP preset would be Ardent Shield, since what Ardent Shield allows is that if you take too much damage, like one in a single instance of damage, if the damage instantly breaks your shield, well, the extra damage isn't going to deal damage to your HP. So this is what Ardent Shield allows your shield to do, but really if you're using a lunar mod, just use the lunar mod that has the best substats for you. However, if you're not on low HP preset, just literally feel free to use anything with the best substats. Then moving on to your pants mod, you have a few options. So you have between Elemental Resonance, you have between Precision Charge, and you also have the last option, if I can't find it, which would be Abnormal Increase. Now starting with Abnormal Increase, this is great if you have too much elemental damage, but not that great if you have too much status damage, since obviously this mod gives up to 30% status damage bonus. Then for Precision Charge, this is the least preferred option, since this mod requires you to consistently hit weak spots to get the elemental damage. Since let's just to make it easier to understand, if you only have one arrow, this means that each time you shoot, you have to hit a weak spot to gain 24% elemental damage bonus. If you miss the weak spot, you're not getting any core effect bonuses, but this is what Precision Charge does. And so lastly, if you lack elemental damage, then you're going to want to run Elemental Resonance, and the reason for this is because for each instance of elemental damage dealt from the previous magazine, the next magazine will gain 1% elemental damage, stacking up to 24%, which is really great. And this mod will especially shine if you're doing AoE content. But of course, do remember that getting that 12% magazine capacity is still incredibly important, so do keep that in mind. This is it for this guide. If you wish to see more Once Human guides or content, then do consider liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and turning on the bell for future video notifications. Comment down below if you have any questions. This is Mon. Peace out.